The snow did not fall gently that winter. It came in relentless waves, burying the village under drifts that reached the eaves of the thatched roofs. The cold was not just a chill in the air, it was a presence, a thief that stole warmth from breath and life from the land. Inside the communal storehouse, the last sacks of grain were counted for the third time that week. The numbers never changed, only grew smaller in the mind with each recount. This is where our story begins, not with a wicked stepmother or a jealous king, but with a simple, terrible arithmetic. There were 147 mouths to feed. There was grain for perhaps 80 if stretched with bark and boiled leather. The rule was clear, written not on parchment but in the hollow cheeks of the children and the silent understanding of every adult. When the stores could not support the whole, the community could not support the weak. It was a calculation of survival, as precise and unfeeling as the geometry of a snowflake. The protagonist of this tale was not cast out for being kind. That is the first misunderstanding we must correct. She was cast out for being merciful in a season that could not afford mercy. Her crime was this: she gave her own ration, a handful of coarse barley, to a family whose father had fallen to the coughing sickness. She did it at night, thinking no one saw, but in a village where every movement was tracked by hungry eyes, nothing went unseen. The council met at dawn. There were no shouts, no dramatic accusations. The eldest, a woman with hands like knotted wood from 70 winters of labor, spoke the verdict. Her voice was flat, worn smooth by necessity. The rule exists not for cruelty, but because the alternative is watching every child starve slowly. Your mercy has stolen food from the mouths of 2 others. The equation is broken. You have placed one life above the survival of the pattern. Therefore, you are the variable we must remove. They did not give her a loaf of sawdust. They gave her the truth, a truth as hard and cold as the iron latch on the storehouse door. They gave her a skin of water, a knife with a good edge, and directions to a valley rumored to have late berries. They also gave her their backs, turning away as she walked beyond the last marker stone. The injustice was not in the act of exile. The villagers believed they were being just, adhering to a law older than any of them. The injustice was in the silence that followed her, not a single cry, not a whispered farewell. The only sound was the wind scraping across the frozen fields and the crunch of her own footsteps in the snow. A sound that seemed to grow louder as the silence of the village deepened. This is the hook, the cruel reality. It is not a singular act of malice by a villain, but the systemic application of a rule for what is perceived as the greater good. The personal cost is absolute, immediate, and visceral. She felt the cold seep through her boots first, a damp ache that climbed her bones. She smelled the smoke from the village hearths fading behind her, replaced by the clean, sterile scent of snow and pine. She touched the knife at her belt, its handle smooth from another's use, a tool now meant for her survival alone. The tension is established here, in the gap between the individual heart and the collective body. Her heart screamed that saving one life was righteous. The body of the village, governed by the slow, grinding logic of scarcity, calculated that her righteousness threatened the organism itself. This is the hidden contract. Survival, for communities living on the knife's edge of famine, was not a right, it was a conditional agreement. You follow the rules that keep the whole intact, and the whole, in turn, grants you a share of its precarious safety. Break the rule, and you break the contract. The consequences are not punishment, they are simply the system rebalancing. To the traditional audience listening to this tale centuries ago, this opening was not a shock, it was a grim nod of recognition. They lived inside that arithmetic. The brutality of the consequence was the point. It made the rule unforgettable. It answered the core question before we even asked it. They accepted it as fair because fairness in that context was not about individual compassion. It was about the brutal, equitable mathematics of preventing total collapse. The mercy she showed was a luxury, and in that winter, luxury was the one thing no one could afford. Her story begins with her walking away from the only world she knew, not because she was hated, but because she was, in the most clinical sense, a threat to its continued existence. And the true weight of the tale lies in asking what happens next, not to her alone, but to the very idea of the rule that cast her out. To understand why that winter's famine felt like the end of the world, we must step back from that single village. From that one woman walking into the white silence, we must look at the land itself, not as a backdrop, but as a character in this story. This was not a bad season. This was what historians would later call the Long Frost. A period of 37 years where the summers grew shorter and the winters bit deeper across the whole continent. The snow in our story was not local weather, it was the advance guard of a changing climate. The hunger was not temporary, it was the new normal. Traditional audiences knew this context in their bones. Their grandparents had told stories of the great hunger of 2 generations past. Their parents had whispered of the lean years that never seemed to end. When they heard a tale that began with snow and starvation, they were not hearing about a singular tragedy. They were hearing about the fundamental condition of their existence. The ground itself had turned against them. The soil that once yielded 3 bushels of wheat per acre now yielded 1, if the late frost did not kill the shoots. The game had retreated to deeper forests, grown lean and wary. The rivers froze solid for months, the ice so thick that not even the strongest axe could reach the water beneath. This historical layer is crucial. It explains the scale of the fear. The village council was not reacting to one woman's act of charity. They were reacting to 3 decades of creeping desperation. Each winter was a test they had barely passed. The storehouse was not just a building. It was the fragile dam holding back a flood of collective memory, the memory of what happens when the dam breaks. When the elders spoke of the rule, they were not inventing cruelty. They were transmitting a survival algorithm forged in the fires of repeated catastrophe. They were the keepers of a painful wisdom, written in the empty cradles of the generation before. The sensory reality of this historical layer was not dramatic, it was cumulative. It was the taste of bread made from ground acorns and dried moss, a gritty, bitter paste that stuck in the throat. It was the smell of a hearth burning green wood that smoked instead of warming, filling the cramped houses with a constant, eye-stinging haze. It was the sound not of wolves howling, but of the deeper silence when the birds did not return in spring. It was the touch of a child's hand, too thin, the bones like little twigs under the skin. This was the atmosphere of an age, the low, constant pressure that shaped every decision, every law, every story told around that smoky fire. The protagonist walked away from her village, but she walked into this larger historical truth. The Valley of Late Berries was not a fairy tale reward. It was a rumor born of that same desperate hope that had people tasting strange roots and boiling tree bark. It was a geographical gamble. For the listeners of old, this grounding in historical reality made the story's opening not just believable, but necessary. The harshness was not narrative excess, it was documentary accuracy. The rule that cast her out was not a plot device. It was a historical fact of life, as real and unyielding as the glacier that was slowly grinding southward, mile by relentless mile. Her personal story is a single thread, but to see its true color, we must see the whole tapestry of the age into which it was woven. A tapestry colored in shades of gray hunger, white cold, and the brown of barren earth. This is the relief this chapter provides. It lowers the heart rate from the immediate shock of exile and grounds us in the why. It asks us to feel the weight of those 37 years on the shoulders of every person in that village. It asks us to understand that their cruelty was born from a love for their children, a love so terrified of loss that it hardened into something that looked, to our modern eyes, like heartlessness. They were not villains. They were survivors of a long emergency, making choices in the dim light of a perpetual twilight. And our protagonist, with her handful of barley, was not a rebel against evil. She was a momentary spark of a different light, a light from a time before the frost, a light that threatened, in their terrified calculus, to burn down the last shelter they had built against the endless winter. Now we must examine the mechanism. The rule that cast her out was not written on stone. It was woven into the fabric of the village itself, into its daily rhythms and unspoken hierarchies. This is the societal layer. The village was not just a collection of people. It was a living organism with its own logic, its own immune system. The rule was that immune system's primary defense. To understand why her mercy was seen as a pathogen, we must dissect how that society functioned under the pressure of the long frost. First, the economy of trust. In times of plenty, trust is social glue. In times of famine, trust becomes a currency more precious than gold, and it must be spent with exacting precision. Every transaction was monitored. Every shared meal was accounted for. The village operated on a system of reciprocal obligation, so tight it could feel like bondage. You worked your assigned plot, you tended the communal animals, you took only your measured share. In return, you received protection from the wilderness and a claim on the collective harvest. This was the contract. Her act of giving away her ration was not just charity, it was a unilateral revision of the contract. It introduced unpredictability into a system that could not tolerate it. She gave to someone who had not earned that specific share through the communal labor pool. She bypassed the elders who were tasked with allocation. In doing so, she did not just feed a sick man's family. She demonstrated that the rules of distribution were not absolute. She created a precedent. And in a system balanced on a knife's edge, a precedent is a crack that can widen into a chasm. If she could give her share away, why couldn't others? If need not work became the new metric, how would they decide whose need was greater? The council's fear was not abstract, it was a fear of cascading failure. Her one act could inspire 10 more. Those 10 acts could collapse the entire allocation algorithm. Then the storehouse would be emptied by compassion long before the spring thaw. The result would not be a few saved lives. It would be the chaotic, agonizing death of the entire community. They had to make her an example, not out of malice, but to reinforce the boundary. The exile was a societal antibiotic, isolating the source of instability before it could infect the whole body. Second, the psychology of scarcity. The long frost had rewired their minds. Hoarding was not greed, it was prudence. Sharing outside the strict system was not generosity, it was recklessness. The villagers saw the world through a lens of perpetual deficit. In that lens, her act looked like madness, a dangerous nostalgia for a world of abundance that no longer existed. They could not afford to see it as virtue. To them, virtue was discipline. Virtue was swallowing your hunger, so your child could have an extra spoonful. Virtue was following the rule even when your heart broke doing it. Her version of virtue, the impulsive, individual kind, was a threat to the collective discipline that was their only shield. This societal analysis reveals the core logic. The brutality of the consequence was proportional to the perceived threat to the social order. The punishment was not for the act itself, but for the systemic risk it represented. This is why traditional audiences accepted it. They lived inside similar, if less extreme, social contracts. They understood that the survival of the group sometimes required sacrifices that felt inhuman on the individual level. The fairy tale was holding up a mirror to their own world, showing them the terrible logic behind their own hardest choices. It was saying, this is the price of staying alive together, the rule is cruel, but the alternative is worse. The story does not ask you to like the rule. It asks you to understand its necessity within that specific, desperate context. It makes the societal machinery visible. We see the gears turning, the cold calculus of the greater good, and we see how one warm human heart can be ground between those gears. The protagonist was not fighting a villain, she was colliding with a system that had been shaped over 37 hard years into a perfect instrument for one purpose, collective endurance. Her crime was that she momentarily forgot the purpose. She remembered instead what it meant to be just a person helping another person. And for that memory, the system ejected her. It had no other function, it could not adapt, it could only preserve itself. And in that act of preservation, it revealed its own deepest flaw, its inability to accommodate the very humanity it was built to protect. The wind found its way through every seam of her coat. It was a searching wind, one that knew the shape of hunger and the hollow places it could settle. She walked for what felt like days, though the sun, hidden behind a blanket of gray cloud, gave no true measure of time. Her world shrank to the next step, the next breath that fogged in the air before her face. The village, with its rules and its cruel arithmetic, was gone. What remained was the raw fact of her own body, its needs, its limitations. This is where we leave the analysis of systems and enter the personal layer of the story. This is relief not from hardship, but from abstraction. We ground ourselves in her senses, in the immediate reality of survival as a solitary being. The snow was not a historical phenomenon here, it was a substance. Sometimes it was a crust that held her weight with a sharp crack. Sometimes it was a deep, soft powder that swallowed her legs to the knee, each step a burning exertion that stole warmth from her core. She learned its textures by the ache in her muscles. The cold was not a climate, it was a sensation that began in her fingertips, a dull numbness that crept toward her palms. She would flex her hands inside her mittens, feeling the painful prickling as blood fought its way back. Her face was a mask of ice, her eyelashes clumping together with frozen breath. The hunger from the village had been a shared ache, a background hum. Out here, it became a specific, gnawing companion. It started as a hollow feeling in her stomach, then became a sharpness behind her eyes, a light hiddenness that made the white landscape swim. She thought of the handful of barley she had given away. She did not regret it, but her body, in its simple animal logic, cursed her for it. This was the personal cost, stripped of all societal justification. It was the body paying the bill for the heart's decision. She followed the directions to the valley, but landmarks were buried. A distinctive rock, a bent tree, all were just soft mounds in an endless white field. She navigated by the slant of the light, by the way the wind carved patterns in the snowdrifts. She was not a hero on a quest. She was a lost animal, using instincts she did not know she had. The knife was her only tool. She used it to cut branches from sheltered pines, building a rough lean-to against the wind each time she needed to rest. She chewed on the resinous pine needles, a bitter, astringent taste that did nothing for the hunger, but gave her mouth something to do besides think of food. She scooped handfuls of clean snow to melt in her mouth, a slow, chilling process that threatened to lower her body temperature further. The silence was immense. It was not the quiet of the village, which was full of suppressed sounds, of coughs and whispers and the creak of floorboards. This was a true silence, broken only by the wind and the occasional groan of a tree burdened with ice. In that silence, her thoughts were deafening. They replayed the council's words, the turned backs. They wondered about the sick man's family. Had her barley helped, or had it only delayed the inevitable? The questions had no answers out here. They just circled like crows over a barren field. This chapter is not about advancing the plot. It is about immersion. It is about making you feel the grain of the wood as she cuts it, the burn in her lungs as she struggles through a drift, the metallic taste of cold on your tongue. It is about the slow, grinding work of staying alive minute by minute, when the grand systems of society have cast you out. There is no helper yet, no stray dog or kind woodcutter. There is only her and the indifferent winter. This is the grounding. This is the story remembering that before there are rules and contracts and historical forces, there is a person alone in the cold. Her virtue, her quiet skill, is not shown in grand action. It is shown in the stubborn refusal to lie down in the snow. It is in the careful placement of each branch for her shelter. It is in the discipline of not eating all the dried meat from her small pouch at once, but rationing it into tiny pieces, each one a promise to her future self. This is the manual of survival at its most basic. It is a manual written in blisters and shallow breaths. And as we walk with her through this white wilderness, we begin to understand something else. The village rule was designed to protect the body of the community. But out here, she is learning a different rule, the rule of the individual body against the world. It is just as merciless, just as demanding. It simply has a different scale. One is about preserving the pattern. The other is about preserving the single thread, and for now, that thread is all she has. We have seen the personal exile and the historical pressure that created it. We have dissected the societal mechanism that enforced it. Now we must connect these dots at the systemic level. This is integration. The rule that cast her out was not just a village law or a response to climate. It was a manifestation of a deeper, abstract system, a system of resource management under existential threat. Think of it as an algorithm, the oldest algorithm humanity ever coded into its social structures: input, scarce resources, and a population. Process, distribute according to contribution and need, with need strictly defined by the system's capacity. Output, survival of the group. The protagonist's act of mercy was bad data. It was an input the algorithm could not process. Giving based on compassion, not calculation, introduced an unpredictable variable. The system's response was not emotional, it was computational. Isolate the corrupted variable to preserve the integrity of the program. Exile. This is why the ending felt fair to traditional audiences. They understood they were living inside systems, not just communities. The fairy tale was showing them the system's logic in its pure, uncompromising form. It was a lesson in cause and effect at the scale of survival itself. Break the rule, and the system self corrects, with you as the error being corrected. Now connect this to her solitary journey. Out in the snow, she is operating under a different, more primitive system. The input is her body's energy. The process is conservation and acquisition. The output is her continued existence. This system is just as ruthless. It does not care about her past virtue. It only cares about caloric balance. She is learning, through pain and exhaustion, that all survival is systematic. The village system was complex, multi-layered. Her personal system is simple, brutal, but they share the same core principle: efficiency under constraint. This connection reveals the hidden contract's true nature. It was not a social contract between people. It was a survival contract between any organism and its environment. The village had formalized this contract into rules. The wilderness enforced it through exposure and hunger. She broke the formal contract. Now she is bound by the raw, informal one. This integration also connects the historical and societal layers. The long frost was an environmental input that tightened the constraints on the village system. The societal rules were the process that adapted to those tighter constraints. Her exile was the output when an individual failed to adapt. Every layer feeds into this systemic logic. The personal cost we felt in the last chapter, the aching muscles and gnawing hunger, that is the system working on the individual scale. The historical famine we understood earlier, that is the system working on the civilizational scale. They are not separate stories. They are different expressions of the same underlying mathematics of scarcity. This chapter does not introduce new depth. It weaves the threads we already have. It shows how the village's cruelty and the winter's cruelty are branches of the same tree. The rule was not arbitrary. It was an emergent property of the system under stress, and her punishment was not vengeance. It was a systemic equilibrium being restored. For the listener, this integration makes the story cohere. It answers the question of why the rule had to be so harsh. Because the system it was protecting had no room for error, a single misplaced act of kindness could trigger a cascade failure. The ending is cruel because the system's tolerance for deviation is zero. Understanding this does not make the ending comfortable, but it makes it comprehensible. It shifts the moral discomfort from why would they do this to her, to what kind of world makes this necessary, and that is the precise goal of the old tales. They were not teaching morality as we think of it today, a code of individual righteousness. They were teaching systems literacy. They were showing people the invisible architecture of their own survival and what happened when you put weight on the wrong beam. The protagonist, walking alone, is now living inside a simpler version of that architecture. And her survival will depend on learning its rules, not breaking them. Let us return to the village. The protagonist is gone, but the system remains. What happens to a system after it has purged an anomaly? This is analysis at the societal layer. We must examine the aftermath, the consequences of enforcing the rule. The morning after her exile, the village did not celebrate. There was no collective sigh of relief. Instead, a different kind of silence descended. It was the silence of a test passed, but at a cost no one wanted to name. The work continued. The grain was measured with the same grim precision. The children were fed their thin porridge. But something had shifted in the social fabric. The rule had been demonstrated, not just spoken. It had moved from theory to lived reality. Everyone had seen it happen. This demonstration had two immediate effects. First, it reinforced compliance. No one else gave away their ration. The sick man's family received nothing more. They watched their father weaken, and they understood why no help came. The message was clear. The system's boundaries were absolute. Compassion stopped at the edge of your own allotted share. This created a brutal efficiency. The grain lasted, the calculations held. The village survived that winter as it had survived the previous ones. From the system's perspective, the exile was a success. It preserved the whole. Second, it damaged social trust in a different way. Before, trust was based on reciprocal obligation within the rules. Now, trust was also tinged with fear. People watched each other more carefully, not just for rule breaking, but for any sign of the weakness that had led to it. They policed each other's emotions. A moment of pity for the exiled woman had to be hidden. A tear for the sick man had to be shed in private. Public displays of empathy became dangerous, a potential signal that you might be the next unstable variable. The village became more brittle, more mechanical. The human connections that had once provided warmth beyond the physical began to atrophy. They were surviving, but the quality of that survival had diminished. This is the new layer of cost we must reveal. The system's enforcement mechanism worked, but it exacted a tax on humanity itself. It traded away social warmth for systemic stability. This is why the traditional audience accepted the ending as fair. They understood this trade. Off they lived it. The fairy tale was showing them the receipt. It was saying, yes, this rule keeps us alive, but look what it costs. Look at the coldness it breeds. Look at the fear it installs in every heart. The fairness was not in the justice of the punishment. The fairness was in the accuracy of the accounting. The story showed both sides of the ledger, the grain saved and the humanity spent. Now, consider the protagonist's absence as a societal factor. Her empty place at the loom, her unused share of chores, these were absorbed by others. The system redistributed her labor obligations seamlessly. In a grim way, her removal made the village slightly more efficient. There was one less person to feed, and her work was done by those who remained, strengthening their claim to the resources. This is the cold logic of triage. Removing one element can improve the function of the whole. The villagers knew this, even if they could not say it aloud. It added a layer of unspoken shame to their survival. They were alive because someone else had been subtracted. This analysis advances our understanding of the core mechanism. The rule was not just about preventing chaos, it was about optimizing a scarce resource system where the resources included both food and social cohesion. The protagonist's mercy threatened the food allocation. Her punishment preserved it but degraded the social cohesion. The system chose food over cohesion. It was a rational choice under the circumstances, but it was a choice with profound psychological consequences. The villagers became prisoners of their own successful system. They could not afford to question it, because questioning it might lead to its collapse. So they accepted the brittleness, the fear, the silent shame. They accepted the cruel ending of her story because it meant the continuing story of their own children. The tale forced them to stare at this choice, to acknowledge its terrible necessity. It did not let them look away. That was its function. To make the hidden cost visible, so that everyone understood exactly what price they were paying to see the next spring. The slope grew steeper and the air grew thinner. She had been climbing for what felt like days, following a faint game trail that wound up the mountainside. Her legs burned with a deep, persistent ache, and her breath came in ragged gasps that tore at her throat. But then she crested a ridge, and the world opened up below her. The valley, it was not the gentle, sun-drenched meadow of hopeful rumors. It was a deep, narrow cleft between two granite shoulders, still thick with snow, but different. She could see it from her high vantage. Dark green patches of pine clung to the southern slopes where the sun might linger. And there, along a frozen stream that snaked through the bottom, were the bare, twisted branches of shrubs. Even from this distance, she could see the dark, shriveled berries clinging to them like forgotten promises. The late berries, they were real. This moment was not a triumph. It was a recalibration of hope. She had not found salvation, only a chance to continue. She began her descent, each step more careful than the last. The snow here was different, layered and unstable. One wrong move could start a slide. She used her knife to cut a long, straight branch, testing the depth ahead of her. The world narrowed to the next safe foothold, the next grip for her numb fingers on an icy rock. This is relief. We return to her, to the slow, meticulous work of survival. We ground ourselves in the sensory details of this new place. The air in the valley was still and cold, but it held a different quality. It smelled of damp stone and pine resin, with a faint, sweet undertone of decay from the berries frozen on their stems. The sound of the wind was muted here, replaced by the occasional crack of ice on the stream and the soft thump of snow falling from an overloaded branch. She reached the first cluster of bushes. The berries were small, hard as pebbles, and a deep, bruised purple. She picked one, put it in her mouth. It was like chewing on a piece of frozen leather, bitter and tannic, but as it thawed against her tongue, a faint, sour sweetness emerged. It was food. Not good food, but food. She began to pick them methodically, her fingers stiff and clumsy with cold. She did not gorge. She placed them carefully in a fold of her cloak. A handful for now, to quiet the worst of the hunger. The rest would be saved. She found a sheltered overhang where the rock met the steep slope, a natural alcove that blocked the prevailing wind. This would be her place. Her first task was fire. Without it, the berries and the cold would kill her just as surely as the open snowfields. She gathered dry twigs from under the densest pines and shreds of bark. Her hands shook as she arranged the tinder. She struck her knife against a piece of flint she had picked up on her climb. The first sparks died in the air. The second skittered across the snow. The third caught on a dry leaf, glowed for a hot, stopping moment, and went out. Her breath fogged in the still air. She tried again and again. On the seventh try, a spark landed true. A tiny flame licked at the bark, caught and grew. She fed it with the care of a mother tending a newborn, adding twigs no thicker than her finger. The smell of wood smoke, sharp and clean, filled the alcove. The heat was a physical shock, a wave of pain as feeling returned to her face and hands. She held her palms so close they almost burned, savoring the sting. This was her first true skill, demonstrated not in a grand gesture, but in this small, vital victory, fire. She melted snow in a curved piece of bark near the flames, making water she could drink without stealing her body's warmth. She roasted a few of the berries on a flat stone, watching them sizzle and soften. They tasted better warm, the bitterness mellowing. As the fire settled into a steady glow, she looked around her alcove. It was about the size of a small room, the floor of packed earth and stone. The back wall was dry. It could be home, not a home of warmth and community, but a home of function, a place where the systems of her body could be maintained. This chapter is about the quiet virtue of competence. It is about the smell of smoke after days of sterile cold. It is about the touch of warmth on skin that had forgotten what warmth felt like. It is about the sound of water bubbling in bark, a tiny, hopeful music. There is no helper yet. The ally here is her own patience, her own attention to detail. She is learning the trade of staying alive. And in this trade, every action matters. The placement of the fire to reflect heat but not smoke her out. The storage of the berries away from moisture. The careful banking of the coals to preserve them through the night. This is the practical survival manual in action. It is not about fighting wolves or building palaces. It is about making a cup from bark. It is about knowing that warmth is more important than food in the first hour. It is about the discipline to save the best berries for tomorrow's hunger. As the long valley twilight deepened, she sat by her fire, a tiny point of light and warmth in the vast, cold dark. She was alone, but she was no longer just surviving minute to minute. She was beginning to build. And the first thing she built was not a shelter or a storehouse. It was a routine, a small, personal system of survival. It was her answer to the village's great, crushing system. Hers was smaller, simpler, and for now it was enough. Her small fire, her cache of berries, her sheltered alcove, these are not just personal victories. They are echoes of a much older story. This is integration at the historical layer. We must connect her individual adaptation to the long arc of human survival. What she is doing in that valley, alone and with primitive tools, is what our species has done for hundreds of thousands of years. She is rediscovering, step by painful step, the fundamental technologies that allowed humans to colonize every climate on Earth: fire, shelter, foraging. These are not inventions, they are rediscoveries. Every person in her village, every person in the traditional audience listening to this tale, was the beneficiary of this accumulated knowledge. Passed down through countless generations, but knowledge can be lost, systems can fail. Her exile forced her down the ladder of civilization, back to its most basic rungs. Her story is a reminder of how thin the veneer of complex society really is. Strip away the community, the rules, the storehouse, and you are left with one person, a knife, and the need to make fire. This connection is vital. It shows that the village's sophisticated system of rationing and rules was built on top of these ancient, individual survival skills. The system managed scarcity at a group level. Her skills managed scarcity at the individual level. They are two sides of the same coin, the collective and the solitary strategies for enduring a harsh world. Now, consider the historical context of the long frost itself. It was not an unprecedented event. The geological and climatic record shows periods of abrupt cooling scattered throughout human history. The last major one had ended only a few centuries before our story, allowing agriculture to spread northward, allowing villages like hers to form. The long frost was a regression, a push back toward a harsher, more nomadic way of life. The village was trying to resist that regression by tightening its social controls. She, by being cast out, was experiencing the regression firsthand. She was living the life of a Paleolithic hunter, gatherer not by choice but by necessity. This integration ties her personal struggle to the grand sweeps of prehistory. It makes her story not an anomaly, but a recurrence. It asks the listener to see her not as a unique victim, but as every woman and man who ever had to face a changing climate with nothing but their wits. The fairy tale, in this light, becomes a memory, a cultural memory of a time when survival was always this immediate, this raw. The brutal consequences in the story feel fair to a traditional audience because they resonate with this deep historical truth. Life for most of human history was brutally consequential. A mistake with fire could mean death by cold. A misidentified berry could mean death by poison. The village rule was just a social extension of this natural law. Make a significant error, and you are removed from the system, just as a failed foraging trip removes you from life. This chapter weaves the threads. The personal skill of fire-making connects to the historical invention of fire. The societal rule of exile connects to the historical reality of population dispersal during resource crashes. They are not separate narratives. They are different time scales of the same narrative, the narrative of life under constraint. Her success in the valley is not a repudiation of the village system. It is a demonstration of the older, more fundamental system that underlies it. She is proving that the individual thread can survive, even when cut from the tapestry. And in doing so, she is embodying the oldest human story of all, the story of adaptation. The listeners knew this story in their bones. Their ancestors had lived it. So when they heard a tale that began with exile and moved to solitary survival, they were not hearing fiction. They were hearing a condensed version of their own deep past. And they accepted the harshness because they understood, at some level, that harshness was the original condition. The village with its cruel rules was the fragile exception. The cold valley with its demanding skills was the enduring rule. We must now name the contract explicitly. This is analysis at the systemic layer, driving the core logic of the entire narrative forward. The hidden contract between mercy and survival is not a metaphor. It is a functional relationship within any resource-limited system. The contract states that mercy, defined as the allocation of resources based on compassion rather than systemic rules, is a luxury good. Its availability is inversely proportional to the scarcity of the resources in question. In conditions of abundance, mercy can be abundant. It costs little. In conditions of scarcity, mercy becomes expensive. It risks the stability of the entire system. Therefore, the contract enforces a trade-off. You can have mercy or you can have systemic survival. You cannot have both when resources are critically constrained. The village understood this contract instinctively. They chose systemic survival. They enforced the boundary by exiling the manifestation of unaffordable mercy. The protagonist in her valley is living under a different clause of the same contract. Her system is her own body. Her resources are her energy, her warmth, her food stores. In this personal system, mercy is also a luxury. Showing mercy to a predator would be fatal. Showing mercy to her future self by not eating all the berries today is actually a form of systemic discipline, not mercy in the compassionate sense. It is a rule she imposes on herself for her own survival. This reveals the contract's brutal symmetry. At the group level, mercy to individuals threatens the group. At the individual level, mercy to anything outside the self threatens the individual. The contract scales. This is why fairy tales are practical survival manuals. They encode this scalable contract in story form. They show the consequences of violating it at different levels. The story of our protagonist shows both levels. She violated it at the group level and suffered the group's enforcement. Now she must adhere to it at the individual level or suffer nature's enforcement. The tales were teaching people to recognize which level of the contract they were operating within, and to adjust their behavior accordingly. Were you in a time of famine, then the group contract was in force, and individual mercy was dangerous. Were you alone in the woods? Then the individual contract was in force, and all mercy was self-directed. The traditional audience accepted brutal consequences because the stories were teaching a vital, non-negotiable law of existence. They were the warning label. This contract also explains the narrative goal of explaining mercy without boundaries. A boundary is the line where the cost of mercy becomes unacceptable to the system's survival. The village's boundary was the edge of the ration system. The protagonist crossed it. Her story is an object lesson in what happens when you do not see or choose to ignore the boundary. The ending feels cruel to us because we live in a world of artificial abundance, where the systemic cost of individual mercy is often hidden. Subsidized by complex global supply chains and social safety nets, the boundary seems invisible, so the punishment seems disproportionate. But to the traditional audience, the boundary was visible every day in the half-empty bowl, in the thin child, in the empty granary. The punishment was proportional to the visible threat. This analysis advances our understanding by moving from description of systems to the articulation of the governing principle. The hidden contract is the principle. It is the rule that makes the rule. It is the reason why the village law existed and why her solitary discipline is necessary. It is the deep logic that connects the societal cruelty to the historical pressure to the personal struggle. They are all expressions of the same equation: mercy plus scarcity equals risk. Different systems manage that risk differently. The village managed it by social exclusion. Nature manages it by death. The fairy tale managed it by telling a story so stark that no one could forget the equation. It made the abstract contract unforgettable by clothing it in the cold snow, the aching hunger, and the sound of a door closing forever. That was its function, to be the memory of the boundary for people who could not afford to forget. The days in the valley began to form a pattern, a slow, patient rhythm dictated by light and hunger. She expanded her territory. She found a stand of cattails by the frozen stream, their brown heads poking through the snow. The roots, she remembered from an old story, could be pounded into a kind of flour. She spent a day digging, her hands cracking in the cold mud, to harvest a bundle of the fibrous tubers. Back at her alcove, she roasted them on stones by the fire. They were bland and starchy, but they filled the emptiness in a way the sour berries could not. This was progress. She was moving from mere foraging to primitive cultivation, from finding food to processing it. She also found tracks. Not just the delicate prints of hairs, but larger, heavier ones that spoke of a deer or an elk passing through the higher reaches of the valley. She did not have the skill to hunt such game, not yet, but the tracks were a promise, a sign that the valley held more than just bitter berries and cattails. One afternoon, as she was gathering firewood, she heard a sound that was not the wind or the ice. It was a low, pained whimper. She followed it cautiously, her knife held ready. Behind a fallen log she found the source. A young wolf, its leg caught and broken in a crack in the rock where it had likely fallen while chasing prey. It was thin, its ribs showing through its grey winter coat. It saw her and bared its teeth, a silent snarl that was more fear than threat. It was trapped, starving, and doomed. This was the moment for the helper, the overlooked ally, but this was not a kind woodcutter or a loyal dog. This was a predator, injured and dangerous. The old tales often spoke of aid coming from the humble, the forgotten, but they also held a deeper truth. Help often comes not from those who are strong, but from those who are also bound by circumstance. Their alliance is not born of kindness, but of mutual need. She looked at the wolf, she looked at her own thin hands, her meager stores. The hidden contract was clear. Mercy here was a luxury. Helping this predator would cost her energy, perhaps her safety. It would gain her nothing. The wolf would not be her friend. It would not guard her or bring her food. The systemic logic said to walk away, or to use her knife and add its meat to her stores. But she did not walk away, and she did not kill it. She spent the better part of an hour gathering stout branches and using strips of bark to lash them into a crude splint. She approached the wolf slowly, speaking in a low, steady voice, the way she might to a frightened child. It snapped at her, but its heart was not in it. The fight was gone, replaced by exhaustion and pain. She managed to brace the broken leg and bind the splint tight. It whined, a sharp, pitiful sound. Then she did something that defied all systemic logic. She took one of her precious roasted cattail roots and placed it on the ground near the wolf's head. Then she retreated to a distance and waited. The wolf ignored the food for a long time. Then, slowly, it stretched its neck and took the root, swallowing it in one gulp. She left more water in a piece of bark. Then she went back to her alcove. She did not expect gratitude. She did not expect an alliance. She acted from a different place, a place the village had tried to stamp out. She acted because she saw another creature in pain, and she was, despite everything, still a person who could not bear to see it. This was not the mercy of giving away her ration that had been a conscious choice, a moral act. This was something more instinctive, more foolish. It was compassion without any calculation of return. It was, by the strict terms of the hidden contract, a violation, but she was no longer inside the village system. She was building her own. And perhaps, just perhaps, the rules could be different here. The wolf did not follow her that night, but in the morning, when she went to check, it was gone. The splint was still on the ground, chewed through. The wolf had freed itself. There was no sign of it. She felt a strange emptiness, not of hunger, but of connection severed. She had helped, and the world had simply absorbed the act without comment. This chapter is relief, storytelling at the societal layer, showing the emergence of a new cultural possibility. It is about the slow, careful building of a life, and the inexplicable, risky act of compassion that interrupts it. It is about the smell of roasting cattail root, earthy and warm. It is about the touch of the rough bark as she lashed the splint. It is about the sound of the wolf's whimper, a note of pure animal distress in the vast quiet. It asks a question: can a new system be built that has room for such acts without collapsing? Or is she repeating her original mistake in a new, solitary context? The story does not answer yet. It simply shows the act and leaves the consequences hanging in the cold valley air. The wolf was gone, but its presence lingered in her mind. It was a reminder of the world outside her small, controlled system. A world of teeth and hunger, of broken legs and silent departures. She continued her work. She built a low wall of stones across the front of her alcove, leaving a narrow entrance. It was not a door she could lock, but it broke the wind and made the space feel more like a room, less like a cave. She organized her stores, berries in one pile, pounded cattail flour wrapped in bark in another, a few strips of dried hare meat from a lucky snare in a third. This was her new granary. It was tiny, but it was hers. She had rules for it: never take from tomorrow's portion, always replace what you use. These were her personal allocation algorithms, echoes of the village's great system, but scaled down to one. This is integration at the systemic layer. We must connect the system she is building to the one that cast her out. They are not opposites. They are variations on a theme. Both systems are designed to manage scarce resources over time. Both have rules to prevent impulsive consumption. Both prioritize future survival over present desire. The key difference is not in the logic, but in the scale and the enforcement mechanism. The village system enforced its rules through social pressure and exile. Her system enforces its rules through the immediate feedback of hunger and cold. If she breaks her own rule and eats all her food today, she will not be exiled by a council. She will simply be hungry tomorrow. The consequence is direct, personal, and inescapable. This connection reveals something profound about the hidden contract. The contract is not inherently social. It is a principle of resource management that applies to any bounded system. Whether that system is a village of 147 or a single person in an alcove, the village externalized the enforcement onto the group. She internalizes the enforcement within her own body and mind. Both are valid adaptations. This integration also connects her act with the wolf to the systemic framework. Was it a violation by the strict logic of her personal survival system? Yes. It cost her time, energy, and a cattail root with no tangible return. It introduced an unpredictable element, the possibility of the wolf returning, perhaps with its pack. But it also introduced something else, a tiny crack in the absolute boundary of the contract. She demonstrated that even in a system of extreme scarcity, a sliver of compassion could be expended without immediate collapse. The system absorbed the cost. She was slightly hungrier that night, but she did not starve. The world did not end. This suggests that the contract, while real, is not a binary switch. It is a gradient. The cost of mercy is high in scarcity, but it is not always infinite. There is a margin, however thin. Her act with the wolf existed in that margin. It was a luxury she could just barely afford. This nuance is crucial. The old tales often show the brutal consequence of crossing the boundary, but they also sometimes show the helper, the act of kindness that is rewarded. This is not a contradiction. It is teaching about the margin. The helper appears when the system has a tiny surplus, when the cost of mercy is low enough to be borne. The wolf appeared when she had just secured a new food source, the cattails. She had a momentary, fragile surplus. She spent it on compassion. The tale is showing both sides, the catastrophic cost of mercy when the system is on the edge, and the possible reward when there is a sliver of slack. By integrating her new life with the old rules, we see the system not as a monolithic monster, but as a dynamic relationship. Its harshness is proportional to the tightness of its constraints. When the constraints relax slightly, even within a solitary struggle, the system can accommodate a gesture that looks like the very thing it punished. This does not forgive the village, but it explains the logic in a more complete way. The village was on the absolute edge with no margin. She, in her valley, had carved out the tiniest of margins through her skill and labor, and in that margin she planted a single, foolish act of kindness. It may grow into nothing, or it may be the seed of something new. The story holds both possibilities in balance, connecting the dots between the iron law and the fragile exception. To fully grasp why harsh endings were accepted as fair, we must look beyond a single village or a single valley. We must analyze the historical record of famine itself. This is analysis at the historical layer, abstract and high concept. Across centuries and continents, human communities facing catastrophic scarcity have developed strikingly similar responses. They are not random acts of cruelty, they are a limited set of survival strategies etched into our collective memory by repeated trauma. The first strategy is triage. The weak, the sick, the very young and very old are often the first to perish, either through passive neglect or active culling. Our village rule was a formalized, preemptive version of this. Exile was a cleaner, more ritualized form of culling, removing a healthy but non-compliant member before scarcity forced harder choices. Historical accounts from the Great Famine in Ireland, the Ukrainian Holodomor, the sieges of Leningrad and Sarajevo, all show this pattern in various forms. When the system breaks down, the social contract reverts to its most basic form: protect the core productive group at all costs. The second strategy is the creation of unforgettable taboos. Societies under long-term stress codify their survival rules into sacred law or foundational myth. Do not waste food, do not share outside the clan, do not show weakness. These are not moral suggestions. They are survival imperatives, wrapped in the authority of tradition or divinity to make them unassailable. The village rule was such a taboo. It was presented not as a choice, but as a natural law, as unchangeable as the winter. The brutal consequence for breaking it served to reinforce its sacred, unbreakable nature. The third strategy is the scapegoat. When a system is under immense stress and the cause is unclear, communities often identify an individual or a group to bear the blame. Their removal is believed to restore balance. The protagonist, in giving away her ration, became a perfect scapegoat. She embodied the dangerous impulse of individual mercy that threatened the collective discipline. By exiling her, the village was not just punishing a crime, it was performing a ritual of purification, casting out the spirit of disorder to protect the whole. This historical analysis reveals that the fairy tale's ending is not a unique invention. It is a narrative distillation of these deep, recurring human patterns. The traditional audience accepted it because these patterns were part of their historical reality, either lived or inherited through story. The tale was holding up a mirror to a truth they already knew, that in the darkest times, communities make choices that would be unthinkable in times of light. The fairness lay in the pattern's familiarity, its terrible logic. It was not fair to the individual scapegoat, it was fair to the pattern of survival itself. The story was teaching that this pattern exists, that it is a trap waiting for communities under pressure. By showing it in action, the tale was a warning. It said, "This is what we become when the snow does not stop. This is the cost of our continuity. Understand it, so you are not surprised when you see its shadow." Now, connect this to the long frost. A 37-year climate event was not just a bad season. It was a historical engine that would have forced these survival strategies to the surface again and again, in village after village. Our story is likely one of thousands. each one ending with someone cast out, or a taboo broken, or a scapegoat chosen. The tales that survived were the ones that captured this historical truth most starkly. They were the ones that served as the best warning labels. They made the abstract pattern concrete, personal, and unforgettable. So when we ask why traditional audiences accepted brutal consequences, the historical answer is this. They were living inside a historical process that regularly produced such consequences. The story was not an exaggeration, it was a reflection. It showed them the hidden gears of their own age turning. And in showing them, it gave them a grim form of agency. If you understand the pattern, you can perhaps navigate it. You can know the cost of breaking the taboo before you break it. You can see the scapegoat mechanism before it chooses you. The fairy tale, in this light, is not just a survival manual for the powerless against the powerful. It is a survival manual for the community against its own darkest impulses. It externalizes the impulse in a villain or a foolish act, shows its catastrophic result, and thus inoculates the listener against it. The ending is the vaccine. It is a small, controlled dose of the horror, administered in story form, to build immunity against the real thing. That is its function, and that is why it had to be cruel. A gentle ending would have been a placebo, a lie that left the community vulnerable to the true disease of collapse. The first sign was not a sound, but a smell. On a morning when the wind shifted to the east, she caught it on the air, a thin, acrid thread woven through the clean scent of pine and snow, wood smoke. But not the sharp, clean smoke of her own small fire. This was thicker, dirtier, the smell of many hearths burning damp fuel. It was the smell of a village. Her heart clenched, a fist of cold fear in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. She climbed to her high vantage point, the ridge where she had first seen the valley. She looked back the way she had come, toward the lands of her old home. At first she saw nothing but the endless white and grey. Then movement, a dark line like a stain, creeping slowly along the base of the distant hills. It was not a single person, it was many. The village was coming, or what was left of it. The sight triggered a flood of memories, not as thoughts, but as sensations. The feel of the rough wool of her old shawl. The taste of the communal stew, thin but warm. The sound of the children's laughter before the hunger silenced them. And then, the colder memories. The turned backs, the silence, the crunch of her own footsteps in the snow. She watched the line for a long time. It moved with the slow, weary pace of people carrying everything they owned. They were not marching to war. They were fleeing. Something had happened. The long frost had finally broken them. Their system, for all its cruel efficiency, had reached its limit. Her valley was on no map. It was a rumor, a story of late berries she had followed. But in a starving landscape, rumors become maps. Desperate people follow whispers. They had heard the same story, or one like it, and now they were here. She went back to her alcove. She looked at her small world with new eyes. It was no longer just a shelter, it was a prize. The berries, the flour, the dried meat, they were treasures now. The wall was not just a windbreak, it was a fortification. The fire was not just warmth. It was a beacon. She had to decide. She could hide. She could take her stores and retreat deeper into the valley, up into the high crags where no one would follow. She could let them pass through, scavenge what they could from the berry bushes and move on, leaving her hidden and safe. Or she could stay. She could meet them. The thought made her hands shake. She touched the stone of her wall, still cold from the night. She smelled the lingering scent of her fire, of roasted cattail root. She heard the quiet drip of melting snow from the alcove roof. This was hers. She had paid for it with loneliness, with cold, with the memory of every aching step. She had built it according to her own rules, rules that had, for a moment, allowed a sliver of compassion for a wounded wolf. Could that system survive the return of the old one? Could her tiny margin withstand the tidal wave of their need? She did not know, but as she watched the distant line creep closer, she realized something. She was no longer the woman who had been cast out. That woman had been defined by the village, by its rules and its rejection. This woman was defined by the valley, by the fire she could make, by the food she could find, by the wall she had built with her own hands. She was still afraid, but the fear was different. It was not the fear of exile. It was the fear of a gardener watching a storm approach her first, fragile seedlings. They entered the valley at dusk. She watched from the trees above her alcove, hidden in the shadows. There were not 147. Perhaps 60, maybe 70. The rest had been lost to the winter, to the journey, or left behind. They moved like ghosts, their shapes blurred by the fading light and their own exhaustion. They did not speak. The only sounds were the crunch of snow, the occasional cough, and the low, fretful cry of a child, quickly hushed. They carried their world on their backs, bundles wrapped in hides and cloth. They did not look like conquerors. They looked like the last embers of a dying fire, scattered by the wind. They made camp in the center of the valley, near the frozen stream. They did not build proper shelters. They simply dropped their bundles and huddled together for warmth. A few tried to light fires, but their wood was wet, their hands shaking. The flames sputtered and died, leaving only smoke and curses. This was the system in its death throes. Its discipline was gone, replaced by a desperate, disorganized scramble. The rules had sustained them for 37 years, but the rules required a home, a storehouse, a boundary to defend. Out here, they were just animals in the cold. She saw familiar faces, made gaunt and strange by hunger and hardship. The elder who had spoken the verdict, her face now a mask of deep lines. The mother of the sick man she had tried to help, clutching a child to her chest. She saw no malice in their eyes, only a hollow, consuming need. This is analysis at the societal layer. We must examine the conflict not as personal vengeance, but as a clash of survival systems. The village system has collapsed. It no longer has the structure to enforce its rules or distribute its resources. It is now just a hungry mob. Her system, by contrast, is intact. It is small, simple, and functional. It has clear boundaries, her alcove, and clear rules, her personal discipline. The conflict is inevitable. A non-functional system will always seek to absorb or consume a functional one nearby. It is a law of social physics. The starving group will see her working fire, her organized stores, and they will want it. Not out of evil, but out of the most basic imperative, survive. The question is not whether they will try to take what she has. The question is how. Will they try to integrate her back into their fold, imposing their broken rules on her working system? Will they simply take by force, dissolving her system into the chaos of their need? Or will they recognize that her system works and try to learn from it? This analysis advances our understanding by framing the return as a systemic crisis. The villain is not a person. It is the vacuum left by a failed social order. That vacuum will pull in whatever resources are nearby to try to fill itself. Her alcove is a resource. Her knowledge is a resource. Her very person is a resource. She represents order in their chaos. And order, in their desperate state, is both a magnet and a threat. It is a magnet because it promises survival. It is a threat because it highlights their failure. They cast her out for disrupting order. Now they are drawn to her because she has created a new order. The irony is perfect and cruel. This is the core logic mechanism of the tale's second act. The exile returns not to take revenge, but to be saved. And the one who was exiled holds the means of salvation. This inverts the traditional power dynamic. The powerless has become powerful through competence. The powerful have become powerless through systemic collapse. But her power is fragile. It is the power of a single lit candle in a vast, windy dark. It can guide, or it can be blown out. The coming hours will test which it is. She watched them shiver in the gathering dark. She smelled their cold, smoky fires. She heard the child's cry cut off into a whimper. These were the people who had turned their backs on her. These were the people whose rule had deemed her life expendable, and now they were here at her threshold, freezing and hungry. The hidden contract was screaming in her ear. Mercy now would be catastrophic. Sharing her meager stores with 70 people would mean everyone starves, including her. Her system would be obliterated, consumed to fuel a few more hours of their collective dying. The contract said to let them freeze. To let the winter finish what their broken system had started. It said to protect her candle, even if it meant watching the rest of the world remain in darkness. But the contract had been forged in the village, for the village. She was no longer in the village. She had built her own system. And in that system, she had already spent a cattail root on a wounded wolf. She had already created a tiny margin for an uncalculated act. Could that margin stretch to cover this? No, it could not. That was the cold, hard arithmetic. But arithmetic was not the only voice in her head. There was another, quieter voice, the voice that remembered the taste of shared stew, even when it was thin, the voice that had made a splint for a predator. That voice asked a different question, not what does the contract demand, but what can I bear to watch? She did not have an answer yet. But as she stood in the cold shadows, watching the ghosts of her past life shiver in the dark, she knew the decision was coming. And she knew it would not be made with a sword. It would be made with her trade, the trade of survival she had learned in this valley. She would have to build a trap, not of poison or stifling cloth, but of a different kind, a trap for chaos. A way to channel their desperate need without letting it destroy what she had built. She turned away from the sight and slipped back into her alcove. The fire glowed warmly, her stores sat in neat piles, her wall kept out the wind. This was her world. And tomorrow she would have to decide whether to open its door. She spent the night not sleeping but thinking. She thought in systems. This is integration at the systemic layer. She had to connect the abstract principles she now understood to the concrete problem outside her wall. The problem was a resource allocation crisis. There were 70 people and one of her. The resources were food, shelter, and knowledge. The village system had failed at allocation. Her system worked for one. The challenge was to design an interface between them. A way for her functional microsystem to interact with their dysfunctional macro system without being consumed. She could not simply give them her stores. That was not an interface. That was a donation, a one-time transfer that would solve nothing and leave everyone, including her, worse off. It would be her original mistake, repeated on a larger scale and with the same catastrophic result. No, the interface had to be transformative. It had to change their behavior. It had to convert their chaotic need into structured labor. It had to use her knowledge as a lever to increase the total resources available, not just redistribute her tiny surplus. She thought of the cattail roots. There were more along the stream, but harvesting and processing them was slow, individual work. She thought of the berry bushes. They were picked clean near her alcove, but there were more further up the valley. Searching for them was haphazard. She thought of fire. They needed fire to survive the night, to cook, to purify water, but they did not know how to make it reliably with wet wood. Her knowledge was the key resource. Her trade was survival. She would fight with that, not to harm them, but to structure them. The trap she would set was not made of poison. It was made of rules. Simple, clear, non-negotiable rules for accessing the resources she controlled, which were primarily her knowledge and the example of her working system. The first rule would be about fire. She would show them how to build a proper fire pit, how to select and dry wood, how to bank coals. But she would not do it for them. She would demonstrate once. Then they would have to build their own, in an assigned area, using the materials she specified. The second rule would be about foraging. She would show them where the cattails were, how to harvest the roots, how to roast them. But the harvesting would be done in teams, and the yield would be brought to a central point for distribution. The third rule, the most important one, would be about boundaries. Her alcove, her personal stores, were off limits. That was the core of her system, and it would remain inviolate. It was the proof that the system worked. It was the seed from which everything else would grow. This interface design was her defense. It was a way to offer help without offering a handout. It was mercy with boundaries, exactly what the village had failed to practice. Their mercy to her had been zero, an absolute boundary with no pathway across. Her mercy to them would have a pathway, but it would be a narrow bridge with strict railings. You could cross, but only if you followed the rules. This integration connects the dots between the personal, societal, and systemic layers. Her personal skill becomes the societal tool for re-establishing order. The systemic principle of bounded mercy finds a practical implementation. The hidden contract is not broken, but its terms are renegotiated. Mercy is allowed, but only when it is channeled through a structure that increases overall system resilience. Her act with the wolf was an unbounded mercy, a tiny, impulsive gift. This would be a bounded mercy, a calculated investment in system repair. As the first grey light of dawn seeped into the valley, she made her decision. She would go out to them. Not as a supplicant, not as a vengeful queen, but as a technician, a specialist in survival. She would offer them a deal. Follow my rules, learn my trade, and you may live. Try to take what is mine, and I will vanish into the high crags, and you will be left with your wet wood and your empty hands. It was a brutal offer, but it was the only one that had a chance of saving anyone, including herself. It was the trap. And they would walk into it willingly, because the alternative was the slow, disorganized freeze they were already experiencing. They were desperate for order. She would give it to them, but on her terms. Terms forged in exile, tested in solitude, and designed not for the happiness of one, but for the possible survival of many. She banked her fire, took a deep breath of the cold air smelling of smoke and pine, and stepped out from behind her wall of stones. She walked toward the huddled group by the stream, her back straight, her hands empty but capable. She was not bringing them a loaf of bread. She was bringing them a blueprint, and the first line on that blueprint was a boundary. They saw her coming. A ripple went through the huddled group, a shifting of bodies, a turning of gaunt faces. No one spoke. Their eyes were wide, not with recognition at first, but with a kind of animal wariness. Then the elder, the woman with the hands like knotted wood, stood up slowly. Her eyes met the protagonists across the frozen ground. There was no apology in that look, no shame, only a deep, weary assessment. The protagonist stopped a dozen paces away. The air between them was so cold it felt solid. She could see the frost on their eyelashes, the blue tinge to their lips. She could smell the sour scent of unwashed bodies and despair. The protagonist spoke first. Her voice was calm, but it carried in the still morning air. I can show you how to make fire that lasts. I can show you where to find food in this valley, but you will not touch what is mine. You will work as I say. You will follow rules. If you agree, you may live here. If you do not, I will leave, and you will be as you are now. It was not a speech. It was a statement of terms. The elder did not answer immediately. She looked past the protagonist, toward the alcove with its stone wall, the thin plume of smoke from the banked fire. She saw order, she saw survival. She turned her gaze back. Her voice, when it came, was a dry rustle. You were cast out for breaking the rule. Now you bring us rules. The protagonist held her gaze. The old rule was to preserve what you had. It worked until it didn't. My rule is to build something new. It is the only thing that works now. A man from the group, one she remembered as a stubborn farmer, spoke up, his voice cracked with cold. Why should we listen to you? You are just one woman. You have a fire, he said. We do not. You have food. We have hunger. That is why. The logic was brutal and irrefutable. They were not listening to her because she was wise or good. They were listening because she had what they needed, and she knew how to get more of it. Her authority came not from tradition or strength, but from demonstrated competence. It was the purest form of power in a survival situation. The elder raised a hand, silencing the farmer. She looked at the protagonist for a long moment. Then she gave a single, slow nod. We will listen. But the rules must be for all. They must be fair. The protagonist almost smiled, a bitter twist of her lips. Fair. That word had meant something different in the storehouse. It had meant the equitable distribution of scarcity. Here, it would mean the equitable distribution of labor and opportunity. It was a different kind of fairness, one based on creation, not rationing. She agreed. The rules will be for all, but I will make them, and I will enforce them. There was no democracy in survival. There was only expertise and consent. They had consented. Now came the hard part. She spent the day teaching. She showed them how to build a proper fire pit, digging down to dry earth, lining it with flat stones to reflect heat. She showed them how to select dead wood from the sheltered sides of trees, how to strip the bark to find dry kindling beneath. She demonstrated the strike of flint and steel, the careful nurturing of the first spark. She did not do it for them. She made them do it, their numb fingers fumbling, their frustration palpable. But by midday, 3 small but steady fires were burning in a row along the stream bank. The smell of clean wood smoke began to replace the smell of damp misery. The warmth was a physical relief that brought silent tears to some eyes. Then she took a group to the cattails. She showed them how to dig for the roots, how to clean them, how to roast them on hot stones. She assigned areas, so they would not overharvest one spot. She appointed the elder to oversee the distribution of the cooked roots, 1 per person at first, to stave off the worst of the hunger. It was not enough. But it was a beginning. As she worked, she felt their eyes on her, not with love or even gratitude, with a desperate, focused attention. She was not their savior. She was their manual, and they were turning the pages as fast as they could. This chapter is about the personal cost of this decision. It is about the weight of being the one who knows, the one who must lead. It is about the smell of roasting cattail root mingling with wood smoke. It is about the sound of instruction given in a calm voice over the crackle of new fire. It is about the touch of a cold hand accepting a warm root, a fleeting, wordless connection. She was giving them a chance, but in doing so, she was tying her fate to theirs again. Her solitary system was gone. She was building a communal one from the ground up, and she was its architect, its teacher, and its first enforcer. The burden was immense. Every mistake would be hers. Every failure would be on her shoulders. The village had cast her out to avoid this burden. Now she was taking it on voluntarily, because the alternative was to watch them die, and she found, to her own surprise, that she could not bear it. Not after the wolf, not after the taste of her own lonely success. She had built a world for one, now she would try to build a world for many, and she knew in her bones that the old tales never ended here. They ended after the test, after the trap was sprung, after justice was done. This was only the middle, the hardest part was yet to come. To understand the gravity of her choice, we must analyze the historical record of what happens when mercy is extended without clear boundaries to a collapsing group. This is analysis at the historical layer, abstract and high concept. History is littered with examples of well-intentioned interventions that accelerated disaster. Consider a besieged city that opens its gates to refugees from the countryside. The immediate act is merciful. But it doubles the number of mouths to feed without increasing the food supply. The result is not salvation for all, but faster starvation for everyone. The city falls sooner and more die. Or consider a nomadic tribe in a drought taking in a weaker band out of kinship. The shared water holes are drained more quickly. The grazing land is overstripped. The entire ecosystem collapses, dooming both groups instead of just one. These are not failures of compassion, they are failures of systems thinking. The mercy was unbounded. It did not account for the carrying capacity of the system. The protagonist is facing this exact historical dilemma. She has a functioning microsystem, her alcove and her knowledge. She is being asked to merge it with a failing macro system, the village remnants. If she simply opens her stores, she replicates the historical pattern. Her system is overwhelmed, its resources exhausted, and total collapse follows. Her innovation, her bounded mercy, is an attempt to break this historical pattern. She is using her knowledge not just to give, but to transform. She is trying to increase the carrying capacity of the valley by teaching new skills and imposing new structures. This is a rare historical pivot. Most tales of collapse are linear, a slow slide into darkness. Her story represents the possibility of a branch, a different path taken, but history also shows that such pivots are fragile. They require unwavering discipline from the leader and buy-in from the followers. They require the suppression of the old, failed instincts, like hoarding or freeloading. And they often require a harsh demonstration of the new rule's consequences. This is where the potential for a cruel ending remains. If someone in the group breaks her new rules, perhaps by trying to steal from her alcove or by hoarding foraged food, she will have to enforce a penalty. That penalty, to be effective, must be memorable. It must reinforce the boundary. In the context of their desperate situation, the only penalties available are severe, social exclusion from the group's fire and food, or physical expulsion from the valley. Either would be a death sentence in the winter. To an outside observer, this would look like the same cruelty the village inflicted on her. But the systemic logic would be different. The village punished her for an act that threatened the system's stability. She would be punishing an act that threatens the new system's stability during its fragile birth. The historical analysis reveals that the fairness of an outcome depends on the system's phase. In a stable, abundant system, harsh punishments seem unjust. In a collapsing system, they are often the only tool to prevent total ruin. In a system being built from collapse, they are a necessary prophylaxis against a relapse into chaos. The traditional audience understood these phases intuitively. She lived through the village's stable phase, its collapse, and now she is attempting the building phase. And she knows, from brutal experience, that the building phase cannot tolerate the unbounded mercy that characterized her original crime. She must be merciless about the rules, even as she is being merciful in offering the rules at all. This is the advanced layer of cost and implication. The cost of building a new system is the burden of being its enforcer. The implication is that to save them, she may have to become, in their eyes, what they once were to her, an agent of cruel necessity. This is the tragic knot at the heart of the tale. Survival often requires us to adopt the tools of the thing we are surviving. She escaped the village system, but to save the villagers, she must create a new system with similar enforcement mechanisms. The difference is in the intent and the outcome. The village system was designed to preserve a dying order. Hers is designed to create a living one. But from the perspective of someone being punished by either system, the cold wind feels the same. This analysis drives the logic forward by showing that the story's tension is not just about food and fire. It is about the cyclical nature of social order and the personal toll of breaking and making it. The protagonist is walking a razor's edge. One misstep, too much mercy or too little, and the whole endeavor falls into the historical ditch of repeated failure. The old tales understood this edge. They showed characters walking it, and they showed the consequences of falling off. That was their warning. Not just about starvation, but about the terrible responsibilities of creation. The test came on the third day. The new routines were taking hold. People were assigned to firewood gathering, to cattail harvesting, to berry foraging parties that ranged further up the valley. The elder oversaw the distribution of the day's cooked roots at the central fire. The system was crude, but it was a system. It had rules, roles, and a tiny growing surplus. Then the farmer, the one who had questioned her, was caught. He had been on a foraging party for berries. When they returned to deposit their harvest in the central basket, his pouch was suspiciously light. A child from the party, a sharp-eyed girl, said she had seen him eating berries as he picked, not just tasting one, but handfuls. The rule was clear. All foraged food was to be brought to the central point for equal distribution. Eating on the job was hoarding. It was a direct violation of the new system's first principle, collective effort for collective survival. The elder brought him before the protagonist at the central fire. The man stood there, his face flushed with a mix of defiance and fear. He had not starved in 3 days. His strength was returning, and with it, his old instincts. He saw the berries as his reward for his labor, not as a shared resource. He was thinking like an individual in a system that demanded he think like a cell in an organism. The protagonist listened to the elder's report. She looked at the man. She could see the old village in his eyes, the mentality of scarcity and personal claim. This was the moment, the historical analysis, the systemic logic, all of it crystallized here. If she let this pass, the rule became a suggestion. Others would follow, the central basket would grow lighter, trust would erode. The fragile new system would begin to unravel from within, consumed by the very individualism it was designed to transcend. She had to act, but what action? A lecture, a reduced ration. In the context of their still precarious state, those were weak signals. They would not be unforgettable. The system needed a strong, clear signal to reinforce the boundary. She remembered the cold silence of her own exile. She remembered the turned backs that had been the village signal. It had worked. It had preserved their system at the cost of her place in it. Now she had to send a signal to preserve her system. The options were limited. She could banish him from the valley. That was a death sentence, and it would mirror her own punishment exactly. It would prove that her new system was just the old one in different clothing. She could not do that, not after everything. She could restrict his food for a day, but that would make him weaker, less able to contribute, and breed resentment. It was a messy, degrading punishment. She needed something clean, symbolic, and effective. She stood up. The gathered people watched, their faces tense. She spoke, her voice calm but carrying. You took food that belonged to everyone. You broke the rule that keeps us alive. Therefore, you will not eat from the common pot today, but you will still work. You will do the hardest work, gathering firewood from the farthest slopes, and you will do it alone. Your share of food today will be given to the child who reported you. That is the rule. The man stared, his defiance crumbling into shock. It was a brutal punishment, a day of hard labor with no food while others ate. And the public shaming of having his share given to a child. It was designed to be humiliating, to make an example of him, but it was not exile. It was a penalty within the system, not expulsion from it. He would suffer, but he would remain. The system would demonstrate its enforcement power without destroying one of its own parts. It was mercy with a boundary, punishment with a path back. The man opened his mouth to protest, but the elder put a hand on his arm. Her grip was firm. She nodded to the protagonist. "It is fair," she said. "The rule is for all." The man looked from the elder to the protagonist, to the silent, watching faces. He saw no support. He saw the new system closing ranks around its rule. He lowered his head and turned to go gather wood. The protagonist watched him go. She felt no satisfaction, only a cold, heavy certainty. This was the cost, this was the burden. She had become the enforcer. She had administered a cruel consequence to preserve the greater good, and the people had accepted it as fair. Just as they had once accepted her exile as fair, the circle was not closed, but it was bending. The difference was in the goal. Their cruelty had been to preserve a dying order. Hers was to nurture a newborn one. But to the man with the empty stomach and the aching back, the difference might feel academic. This chapter is integration at the systemic layer, connecting the historical analysis to the concrete event. It shows the abstract principle of bounded mercy, a necessary enforcement manifesting in a difficult decision. It connects the dots between the village's past action and her present one, highlighting both the similarity and the crucial divergence. The punishment is not the end, it is a test of the system's integrity. If the man accepts it and returns to the fold, the system grows stronger. If he rebels or collapses, it reveals a flaw. The story holds its breath. The trap she built, the trap of rules, has just snapped shut on its first victim. And she, the architect, must live with the sound. The farmer returned at dusk, his shoulders slumped under a heavy load of firewood. He dropped it by the central fire without a word. His face was pale with exhaustion, his hands raw from the cold and labor. He did not look at anyone. He simply went to the edge of the camp and sat down, wrapping his arms around himself. The protagonist watched him. She felt the weight of every pair of eyes that flicked from him to her and back again. This was the aftermath. This was where the system proved itself, not in the punishment, but in the reintegration. The elder brought the evening distribution of roasted cattail roots. She gave one to the farmer. He looked at it, then at the elder, confusion and a flicker of hope in his eyes. The elder said, "Your work today earned this. The rule is for all. The punishment was for yesterday. Today is a new day." He took the root. He ate it slowly, savoring each bite. He did not thank her, but he did not leave. He stayed by the fire, absorbing its warmth. The tension in the camp began to ease. The message had been received. The rule was firm, but it was not capricious. It had a logic and it had an end. You could break it and suffer, but you could also return. This was different from the village's exile, which was permanent, absolute. Her system had a capacity for forgiveness, but only after the debt was paid. This is relief, storytelling at the societal layer, showing the cultural rituals of justice and reintegration. We ground ourselves in the atmosphere of the camp, in the shared understanding being forged around the fire. The days that followed saw a subtle shift. The foraging parties were more diligent. The central basket grew a little fuller. People began to talk more, not just about survival, but about small things, a memory of a song, a story about a summer festival from before the frost. The camp began to feel less like a desperate huddle and more like a community, albeit a thin and battered one. They started building proper shelters, lean, toss against the southern rock face, using techniques she showed them. The valley began to show signs of human habitation beyond survival, signs of intention. Smoke rose from multiple hearths at regular times. Paths were worn in the snow between the shelters and the work areas. The sound of voices, though still tired, lost some of its desperate edge. The protagonist continued to teach. She showed them how to set simple snares for hares. She organized a group to dig a deep pit near a game trail she had scouted, a project for larger prey. She was no longer just the manual. She was becoming the leader, but her leadership was based on competence, not tradition. She led from the front, working alongside them. Her alcove remained inviolate, a symbol of the system's core principle: personal space earned through personal labor. No one challenged it again. The farmer, whose name was Kale, became one of her most reliable workers. He did not speak to her directly, but he followed instructions without complaint. He had learned the cost of the old way, and he had chosen the new one. This was the societal collapse and restoration in miniature. The old order, based on rigid tradition and fear, had broken. The new order, based on demonstrated skill and clear rules, was being built. And it was being built with the same people who had enforced the old one. They were not villains redeemed. They were survivors adapting. This chapter provides atmospheric resolution to the immediate conflict. It shows the system working, not perfectly, but functioning. It shows mercy and justice in balance. The cruel consequence had served its purpose. It had been a vaccination, as the historical analysis suggested, a small, controlled dose of hardship to inoculate the group against the larger disease of systemic collapse, and it had worked. The group was healthier for it. They had passed through the trap and emerged on the other side, not destroyed, but disciplined. This is the societal layer's answer to the core question. Traditional audiences accepted brutal consequences because they saw them as necessary medicine for a sick social body. The story showed the diagnosis, the treatment, and the recovery. The cruelty was part of the treatment. Without it, the patient might have died. With it, there was a chance. And in the flickering light of the communal fires, with the smell of roasting roots and wood smoke in the air, that chance began to feel like a future. It was not happily ever after. It was peace restored through wisdom, the hard, one wisdom of boundaries, of rules, and of the price paid when they are broken, and the grace offered when that price is paid in full. Now we must analyze why this ending, which feels like a hard, won stability to us, would have felt fair to a traditional audience, yet feels cruel or uncomfortable to a modern one. This is analysis at the systemic layer, driving the final logic about changing contexts. The difference lies in the default conditions of survival. For the traditional audience, scarcity was the baseline. Abundance was the rare, fleeting exception. Their world was one of tight constraints, where the hidden contract between mercy and survival was a daily reality. In that world, a story ending with a harsh punishment for rule breaking was not a shock, it was a confirmation. It validated their lived experience that the world was unforgiving, and that social rules were the thin wall against that unforgivingness. The fairness was in the story's alignment with reality. It was a map that matched the territory. For the modern audience, especially in developed societies, abundance is often the baseline. Scarcity is the managed exception, handled by complex, impersonal systems like insurance, welfare, and global supply chains. The hidden contract is obscured. Mercy, in the form of charity or social programs, often appears to have no direct cost to the giver or to systemic stability. The boundaries seem arbitrary, even cruel. When we hear a tale where someone is exiled for sharing food, our immediate reaction is moral outrage. The punishment seems grotesquely disproportionate to the crime. This is because we are judging the story by the rules of our world, a world of artificial abundance, not by the rules of the story's world. A world of natural scarcity. The story feels cruel because it imports the harsh logic of scarcity into our mental landscape of abundance. It is an alien artifact. But the story's function was not to describe a universal morality. It was to describe a specific survival strategy for a specific set of conditions. It was a manual for operating a system under extreme duress. When those conditions no longer apply, the manual seems unnecessarily brutal. We have lost the context. This analysis reveals a new layer of implication. The discomfort we feel is not a flaw in the tale, it is a diagnostic tool. It tells us something about our own distance from the edge. Our moral outrage is a luxury paid for by the systems that buffer us from immediate survival pressures. The tale holds up a mirror and shows us that our morality is conditional, built on a foundation of surplus we did not create and often do not see. Furthermore, the modern discomfort often focuses on the lack of a redemptive arc for the villain or a softening of the punishment. But in the logic of systemic survival, redemption is a secondary concern. The primary concern is system integrity. A redemptive arc is a narrative luxury that can be afforded when the system is stable. In a collapsing or building system, the lesson must be stark to be effective. The punishment must be unforgettable, so the rule becomes unbreakable. Redemption can come later, after the system is secure, as we saw with the farmer Kale. But in the compressed time of a fairy tale, the focus is on the foundational lesson, not the subsequent grace. This is why the endings feel abrupt and cruel to us. They are teaching the first, hardest lesson and then stopping. They assume the listener will understand that life continues after the lesson, that reintegration is possible, but only after the lesson is learned. The traditional audience understood this. They lived in a world where lessons were often harsh, and grace was scarce but real. The tale was giving them the tool, the harsh lesson. They were expected to supply the context of a continuing life where that tool might be used. So, when we ask why traditional audiences accepted brutal consequences as fair, the systemic answer is this. They were living inside the reality the story described. The story was not a fantasy, it was a reflection. Its brutality was the brutality of their world, distilled into narrative form to make it comprehensible and memorable. It was fair because it was true. Our modern sense of its cruelty is a measure of how far we have moved from that truth. A truth that still underlies our comfortable world, but is now buried under layers of infrastructure and abstraction. The story, in its starkness, digs down to that buried truth and shows it to us, and we flinch. Not because the story is wrong, but because we have forgotten what it feels like to live with that truth every day. The ending is a reminder, a cold touch of a reality we have walled away. And that reminder, that discomfort, is perhaps the story's most enduring gift to a modern audience. It asks us to remember the cost of our comfort and the brutal rules that were once necessary to buy it. We must now connect the story's resolution to the long arc of human history, to the civilization shifts from scarcity to abundance. This is integration at the historical layer. The long frost in our story is not just a plot device. It represents one of the many climatic downturns that have punctuated human history, each one a reset button on complexity. The village rigid system was a typical response, a closing of ranks, a hardening of boundaries. It was a strategy for endurance, not growth. The protagonist's exile and subsequent innovation represent a different historical pathway, dispersal and adaptation. When a core community fails, its members scatter, carrying fragments of knowledge into new niches. Sometimes they perish. Sometimes, like her, they find a valley and survive. And sometimes, if they are skilled and lucky, they build something new that can eventually reintegrate the old. This is the pattern of human resilience. Collapse and regeneration. The harsh endings of fairy tales often capture the moment of collapse, the terrible cost of maintaining a failing system. But embedded within them is the seed of regeneration, the exiled individual who carries the knowledge forward. Our story makes this explicit. It shows the collapse, the exile, the regeneration, and the fraught reintegration. It connects the dots across the historical cycle. Now, consider the shift from the long frost to whatever comes after. In our world, the Little Ice Age gave way to warmer periods, allowing population growth and technological innovation. The constraints relaxed. The hidden contracts terms changed, mercy became more affordable, boundaries could soften without immediate systemic risk. The brutal rules of the famine years could be remembered as cautionary tales, not as daily law. This is the historical context that eventually makes the old tales seem cruel to descendants living in the warmer, more abundant times. They are artifacts of a past age of constraint, preserved because they contain wisdom, but their immediate applicability has faded. The protagonist's new community in the valley, if it survives, will eventually experience this shift. The rules she enforced so strictly, the punishment she meted out to Kale, will become part of their foundation myth. A story told to children about the hard winter when Grandma Anya, for that is what they might call her, taught them how to live. The cruelty of the punishment will be remembered, but its necessity will be explained by the context of the time. It will become a lesson in itself, a lesson about how rules must adapt to circumstances. This integration connects the personal story to the civilizational scale. Her actions are a microcosm of humanity's struggle with constraint and adaptation. The fairy tale, in showing this complete arc, serves as a compact history lesson. It says, this is how we survived the hard times, this is the price we paid, and this is how we built again. For the traditional audience living in the shadow of such cycles, the tale was both a memory and a manual. It remembered the cost of the last downturn. And it manualized the skills, both practical and social, needed to navigate the next one. The ending felt fair because it was honest about the cost. It did not sugarcoat the sacrifices required for continuity. It showed that survival sometimes demands that we make choices that haunt us, that we become, for a time, the enforcers of harsh laws so that others might live to see a day when those laws can be relaxed. This is the wisdom of the old tales. They do not promise a happy ending in the sense of universal comfort and justice. They promise a restored order, a peace bought with wisdom, which often includes the bitter wisdom of necessary cruelty. They promise that life continues, that systems can be rebuilt, but that the blueprint for rebuilding is written in the scars of the ones who survived the collapse. As we near the end of our own tale, we see the valley community not as a happily ever after paradise, but as a functioning system, fragile but alive. The smell of wood smoke is constant now. The sound of voices has a rhythm. The touch of shared labor has calloused their hands but warmed their connections. They are not out of the winter yet, but they are no longer dying. They are living according to new rules, forged in the cold heart of the old ones. And the woman who was once cast out walks among them, not as a queen, but as the keeper of the fire, the rememberer of the cost, and the architect of their second chance. The first green shoot appeared not in the soil, which was still frozen hard, but in a sheltered crevice where the sun lingered for an extra hour each afternoon. It was a tiny, brave spear of pale green, a kind of moss or early lichen. The child who found it, the same sharp-eyed girl who had reported Kale, brought it to the protagonist, cupped in her hands like a precious jewel. "Look," she whispered. The protagonist took the offering, feeling the fragile coolness of the tiny plant against her palm. She did not say anything grand. She simply nodded and said, "Spring is coming." Then she gave it back. "Keep it safe." The girl ran off to show the others. That night, around the central fire, there was a different feeling in the air. It was not just the warmth or the full, though still modest, feeling in their bellies from a successful hare snare and the last of the stored berries. It was a sense of time turning. The endless white winter had a crack in it, and through that crack, a sliver of green had entered. The protagonist walked away from the firelight, back to her alcove. Her wall of stones stood as it always had. Her fire glowed within. But she did not go inside immediately. She stood at the entrance and looked back at the camp. The fires dotted the valley floor like fallen stars. The low murmur of voices, a man telling a story, a child's laugh, the sound of someone shaping wood with a knife. These were the sounds of life, not just survival. She touched the cold stone of her wall. This place had been her whole world. It had been her exile and her fortress. Now it was just her home, one home among many beginning to dot the valley. The boundary it represented was still there, but it no longer felt like a barricade. It felt like a choice. She could open it or keep it closed. The system she had built was strong enough now that her personal choice did not threaten it. She thought of the wolf. She had not seen it again. But sometimes in the deep of night she heard a howl from the high crags, a clean, lonely sound that spoke of a different kind of survival. A survival without walls or rules. She did not envy it, but she understood it. They were both creatures who had passed through the same cold and found their own ways to endure. She went inside her alcove. The smell of smoke and earth was familiar, comforting. She banked the fire for the night, the routine as automatic as breathing. She lay down on a bed of pine boughs and hides, listening to the wind outside. It did not sound like a thief anymore. It sounded like the world breathing. In the quiet dark, she allowed herself to remember the village, not with the sharp pain of betrayal, but with the softer ache of loss. They had been wrong to cast her out, but they had not been evil. They had been afraid, trapped in a system that offered no good choices. She had been given a terrible choice, and she had made it. And from that choice, this new life had grown. It was not a happy ending. Happy endings are for stories that stop. This was a continuing story. There would be more winters. There would be conflicts, failures, perhaps more hard punishments. But there would also be green shoots and children's laughter and the shared warmth of a fire. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was life, negotiated daily with the cold and the hunger, but negotiated from a place of strength, not desperation. The wisdom was in knowing the difference. The peace was in accepting the cost. As she drifted towards sleep, the last thing she felt was not the cold, but the memory of that tiny green shoot against her palm. A promise from the earth that the long frost, like all things, would eventually end, and when it did, the rules could change again. The boundaries could soften. The hidden contract could be rewritten in ink of sunlight and growth instead of blood and snow. But until that day, they had the rules she had given them, and they had each other. And for now, in the quiet heart of the still, frozen valley, that was a kind of miracle. The evidence is presented. The village had 147 mouths, grain for 80. The rule was clear. She gave a ration away. The council met. The verdict was exile. She walked into the snow. The long frost lasted 37 years. The village system optimized for preservation. It traded humanity for stability. It cast out the anomaly. She survived. She found a valley. She built fire. She foraged berries. She processed cattails. She built a wall. She created a personal system. The village system collapsed. 70 survivors arrived in the valley. They were a failing system seeking a functional one. She offered bounded mercy. She offered rules in exchange for knowledge. The rule was all food to the central basket. The farmer Kale broke it. He ate berries while foraging. The punishment was a day of hard labor without food. His share went to the child who reported him. He served the punishment. He was reintegrated. The group's discipline tightened. Their efficiency improved. Shelters were built. Snares were set. A green shoot appeared. Spring was coming. The hidden contract states mercy is a luxury inversely proportional to scarcity. In extreme scarcity, mercy without boundaries risks systemic collapse. The village enforced this with exile, she enforced it with a temporary penalty. Both actions were systemic corrections. The traditional audience lived in a world of scarcity. The contract was visible, the punishment aligned with reality, it felt fair. The modern audience lives in a world of artificial abundance. The contract is obscured, the punishment seems disproportionate, it feels cruel. The fairy tale is a survival manual for conditions of constraint. It encodes the scalable logic of the hidden contract. It shows the consequence of violation at the group level, exile. It shows the consequence of violation at the individual level, hunger and cold. It shows the possibility of bounded mercy during system building, the penalty with a path back. It shows the transition from collapse to regeneration. The tale does not moralize, it presents the algorithm, input, scarce resources and a rule violation. Process, systemic correction to preserve integrity. Output, survival of the system, often at great cost to the individual. The ending is not about justice in the abstract. It is about systemic integrity under duress. The audience's judgment of its fairness is a function of their distance from the duress. The evidence is complete. The rule is understood.